Welcome back to the Gramophone Podcast. Today, I'm here with Leah Broad and Samantha Ege. Thank you so much for joining me on the Gramophone Podcast.
Thanks for having us in.
So Leah is an author and journalist specialising in 20th century music, especially women in music. And Samantha is a pianist, author and music historian. As you said, the combined world knowledge on Avril Coleridge-Taylor to talk about this new release, which is out today. Avril Coleridge-Taylor orchestral works out on Resonus, including, very excitingly, the world premiere recording of the Avril Coleridge-Taylor Piano Concerto with Samantha as soloist. And it's really weird because I remember you chit-chatting in Leah's kitchen about this.
Yeah.
Years ago. 2 years ago or something. And it's so incredible that now you're here. So let's start, I guess, with Avril Coleridge-Taylor as a person. Because you say Coleridge-Taylor, musical people will think Samuel. Did she suffer from being Samuel's daughter?
I think she probably both suffered and
Gained.
Exactly, right? So I think in her lifetime as well, you heard Coleridge-Taylor, you thought Samuel. This opened tons of doors for her when she was young and starting out, right? Because people kind of were interested in ideas about genetic inheritance and could the genius of the father pass on to the daughter. But then as she sort of gets later in her life and people start to compare her quite negatively to Samuel, and I think it must be so difficult trying to find your own voice and everybody is constantly comparing you to somebody who you adore, right? Like she loved her father, she loved his music, she grew up singing it. That must be such a difficult thing. Ultimately, he was a really important presence in her life, personally and musically. And so it's really fascinating teasing out those, the complexities of that relationship. And one of the movements in the piano concerto was dedicated to her father, as is another piece on the disc. So really, he's a very large presence in her musical existence, I think.
And before you were asked to take on the piano concerto, had you done much research into Avril as a person? What did you kind of know about her life before this project?
Yes, I had known about Avril for quite a while. And for me, there was definitely a barrier to getting to know her music because of this story that follows her around of her trying to make a life in apartheid South Africa. And that, on a personal level, is a very difficult thing to sort of reconcile. How could she do that? And, what does that mean for me playing her music? What am I championing and endorsing here? And so she kind of stuck in my mind as she was kind of this presence, I think, where I was always aware of her and always wanting to figure out what I would do. And I'm really glad that actually I got the opportunity to kind of work through those barriers and to learn a lot more about why she went to South Africa and to learn that actually the story was not as it appeared. But it's interesting, though, to think that it's not just me who had those sort of negative preconceptions. I think quite a lot of other people did too, and especially across the pond, the African-American communities that supported her father could not really get behind Avril because of her decision-making. But there is a lot more to the story, as I'm sure we'll get into.
Her father, tell me about his background and kind of how racially that kind of impacted her.
Yeah, so he never knew his father. His father was from Sierra Leone and perhaps even had no idea that Samuel existed. Samuel grew up in a white working class family, but his musical talent was really apparent from the outset. And he went to the Royal College of Music, and he was an absolute standout student. He absolutely experienced racial prejudice, but I think that being in an artistic environment allowed him to express himself in different ways and prove himself in different ways. But actually during his time there, he began to reconnect, I would say, with his African heritage. There was a lot of what you might call a precursor to the civil rights movement. There were a lot of leaders leading discussions about racial equality and passing through London, and Samuel Coleridge-Taylor would attend these conferences. So he was really, taking shape, I would say, as an activist as well as a musician. Yeah, interestingly, that wasn't directly passed down to Avril, but, I think that she she grew up with a sense of being British first, and we've talked about this. You know, I reflect on the fact that I think Samuel gave her a sense of home and identity in the UK that she really, really did take to heart. And so that has its own complications. But I think she just really felt proud of where she was from, proud of her father, not defined by race in the way that she might have been had she been born in the US, for example.
In her early career, she was often supported and promoted by groups that were kind of dedicated to racial uplift in the UK, who had supported her father and wanted to sort of engage with her as Samuel Coleridge-Taylor's daughter. So she sang with Roland Hayes in Hiawatha, and she did quite a lot, I think, in her early life that was closer to where her father was heading in terms of activism. And then she pulls away from that later in her life. And it is, I think, is so curious to see that sense of identity shift. And I think it is she always thought of herself, her Englishness was so important to her. And there's a letter in the BBC archive where one of the few times she wrote in to like really complain to the BBC was when they introduced her father wrong and said he was not British. And this made her furious. And she was like, you need to correct this. He was British. And that Britishness was so integral to her and her identity, and also to how she perceived her father's identity as well.
Sort of tell me about how this album is shaped by her life. That's quite a big question, I guess. But are we in this album looking at Avril's music throughout her life? Or is it more weighted to the time later on? Like, tell me about kind of how the timeline of this album.
So this is the first album fully dedicated to her as an orchestral composer, and it's exclusively her works. And so I think it was quite, when I was planning out this album with Sam and John, we thought it was quite important to give a sense of her full voice as a composer. So we've got sort of her early orchestral work that was written around 1930 called To April, which was one of the first orchestral pieces she writes as a sort of serious composer, right the way through to the end of her life. So we've got the full spectrum of her composition here. And one of the things that I find so exciting about her as a composer is she wrote very autobiographically. She responds very directly to events that are happening in her life. They'll often, be the title of the work she writes very programmatically, very theatrically. And so you can kind of trace her autobiography through the music and vice versa. So we've got a piece that she wrote on the plane to South Africa called the Comet Prelude, and that gives us a snapshot, I think, of how she felt. It's sort of sad to listen to in some ways because it's so exciting, so naive, and you know that she is heading towards South Africa under apartheid, and it's sort of like, how, as you were saying, how can you square this to yourself? And then there are also pieces like the Piano Concerto. Each movement is dedicated to somebody different who meant a lot to her. Then there's Sussex Landscape that was written during World War II. So we've really got a huge spectrum of Avril's voice and who she was and who she became.
And I know Sussex Landscape is a piece that has been heard at the proms and performed a few times. But Samantha, what's your understanding about why her music hasn't had such a life until now? Why has it taken a long time for this recording, for example, to happen?
Yeah, well, as I said in another interview, she needed an orchestra, right? So that's what we have with this project. We have a huge institution getting behind it. When you think of even her contemporaries creating festivals in their names, creating archives, ensuring their legacies, and getting institutions attached to that. She doesn't have any of that, and there's so much that she's doing by herself. There are, I think, a variety of factors in terms of why it's taken so long. But honestly, you do need, the endorsement of an institution. You need an infrastructure in order to make a project such as this happen. So here we are. But it's interesting to have that realization of the BBC being, you know, one of her sort of key antagonists, and the fact that we get to sort of, they get to redeem themselves in a way through this.
From what I've read of what you've written, Leah, she was quite a frustrated person. I mean, tell me about her emotional life and connection to her own compositions and career. It sounds like she wanted a lot more than she ever really achieved. Is that true?
And fairly so, I think. She believed until the day she died in the quality of her music. She was like, I am a composer. That's me, right? That she was so set in who she was, and she knew exactly what her sound was. And even when it was very unpopular to write very melodically, in the later 20th century when she's writing, she sticks to it. She knows what her sound is and why she's writing in the way that she does. But she really struggles to gain acceptance from larger institutions like the BBC. So the Written Archive has a very fruity collection of letters between Avril Coleridge-Taylor and the BBC, and the reports on her music, which are excruciating, honestly, to read. You know, she's dismissed as childish. I think there's perhaps some difficulty in understanding her sound world when they come to her music that comes out in really very dismissive statements. On the other hand, you know, I think she really pushes for her music, and I think she was really right to do so, because the piece Sussex Landscape that Chineke recorded and has since been picked up, I think it really has its quality has spoken for itself. It has been done at the Proms. It has been picked up by other orchestras. And I'm hoping this album will do the same for the rest of her orchestral works. And I think she was absolutely right to fight for herself. And how frustrating for her that in her lifetime people couldn't hear what she had to offer. So I think she's a composer who was sort of ahead of her time, and being trapped through the ears of people who didn't understand her, I think did come out in a feeling of real frustration.
Or didn't want to understand her.
Yeah.
What feels like the sort of central piece of this album is the piano concerto, which, as I said, is the world premiere recording. When, Samantha, you first got the score and started looking through it, do you remember what your initial reaction was?
I should say scores, because there were three, not necessarily versions, but three manuscripts. One's the full orchestral manuscript. One was for the first piano, and one was a piano reduction. And among them, the solo parts were slightly different. And so I consulted all three, but I found it quite a challenge to kind of get a sense of who she was just immediately off the score. And so as I'm playing the music, it almost feels like, being a painter or something like that. And everything is quite abstract to begin with, and you're trying to sort of find the definition and find the likeness or whatever. You're trying to make it resemble what you think it should resemble, but you've also got nothing to go by.
And no orchestral colour to kind of...
No. So you're just kind of finding your way. But there would be moments where all of a sudden it clicked, but it felt like quite a long time to get there. But I guess I knew I would eventually get there. I think I was driven by this sense of finding my British sound, and it's quite difficult to put into words what that means. But I think in the same way that Avril felt very connected to her identity, this whole process was very introspective and made me feel, I guess, quite vulnerable in thinking about my own Britishness and my British sound. I play so much American music, and this is a very different world. And then on top of that, you've got Avril's quirks and her idiosyncrasies. And, there'd be times in the score where she'll write a note and then put a question mark. And then it's like, am I responding? Okay, yes, I think so, and I really felt like I was in conversation with her. There would be times as well where I think, okay, I think that she perhaps had her own shorthand. Maybe she meant this. And I think from a lot of the work I've done with handwritten manuscripts, it takes a lot of confidence to think that, okay, maybe a composer has a slightly different intention to what they've put on the score. So I'm glad that I had that experience, because it did give me the confidence to say, actually, Avril, I think I disagree with you here. I'm going to try something else, and hope that you're going to be okay with it. The moment where I heard the concerto, we recorded it in January of this year and then heard it over the summer. I held my breath and closed my eyes and just felt this immense, I don't know, anticipation. And then as I heard everything come together, there was just this incredible release of like, oh my goodness, here she is. And it just really felt like her whole form, going back to that painting analogy, her whole form just came to life in front of me. As I said, I don't know how to describe that British sound, but that was it. I did it. I feel just this immense pride in getting to this point.
My goodness, I feel like that sense of a whole is certainly what struck me listening to the concerto. It does feel very much like, there's a kind of emotional sense of like her identity. You're sort of learning about her through the journey of the concerto. Especially starting the disc with it. That feels like a lovely way of like being introduced to her. Let's talk about like her sound and the music of Avril. How would you, Leah, describe the sort of idiosyncrasy or the school of music that we're talking about here?
Well, so she's very much in the sort of on the bridge between late Romantic and modernism. If you like kind of Rachmaninoff film scores, you're probably going to find something you enjoy in Avril Coleridge-Taylor, but her sound is so different to that. She's very influenced by her father. We can hear elements of Samuel Coleridge-Taylor in there. There's some British light music as well. She's really unique. I can't think of another British composer who sounds exactly like her in the 20th century. She really has something individual to say. And it's been interesting. I think this whole album has been a kind of process of recovery and discovery at the same time, because as Sam was saying, every single piece on this disc comes from a manuscript. And I think we take for granted being able to go and read from a printed score where somebody else has made all the editorial decisions. And we're here doing this album with our WhatsApp group going, is that a D flat? But I think a lot of people have been involved in the editorial process, because there's been a real sense of responsibility in terms of, this is the first big disc for her orchestra. This is her moment to shine. We've got to get it right. And I'm so excited for people to hear it, because when we got the edit through and we were sat there going like, we've got our tea, we're going to sit, we're going to listen. And it was really emotional hearing it all come together with gorgeous rich sound from the BBC Phil. I think John's done a great job conducting. Then you got Sam's solo part, and I was in tears listening to that. So beautiful. And I really hope that listeners will come to her with like open ears and will be able to hear what she has to offer.
Samantha, you're in like quite a unique position of being both a soloist and a researcher and a historian. Can you tell me about how does that influence the way that you perform music by composers that you are so embedded in historically as well and have researched so deeply?
Yes, I mean, I think that with this project, it was quite nice to be the pianist first,
sure,
and to let Leah be the historian, because it is a lot of work to be both. And I would say that with with some of my Florence Price recordings and performances, I'm so informed by the history that I think that there can be, I've had to take breaks from certain works just because writing about it and performing it is a lot, and interpretations can get kind of stale if you are approaching things from both angles with such intensity. You need to take a step back. And so to be the pianist in this project was really quite interesting, because I think that more of my, I guess, emotional sense could be brought to the table rather than being the intellectual, being the academic in this project. But that said, I'm clearly a music historian because I was very happy to work with the handwritten manuscripts, to be thinking as well about, so the third movement of the piano concerto is dedicated to her father. And this was the one that she had performed in South Africa, this particular movement. And so I'm actually thinking about that history as I am playing the work, because, and I think that was the turning point for me, realizing that she went to this country and she never denied who her father was. In fact, of all the movements of the concerto, this was the one that she championed. And so I feel that history, I feel like I definitely brought that sort of energy of affirming oneself, affirming one's history through performance. So I don't think I could completely neglect my historian side. But one of the many joys of this project has been to I would say sort of share the load, to share that responsibility of, I wasn't the editor and the historian and writing the sleeve notes and learning the music and, all of these things that I've done with previous projects. And like, I know that there was a lot of work for you to do as well, Leah. But it was just really lovely to just focus on playing the piano well.
Tell me about the future now of her music. What you've gone through these manuscripts.
Yeah.
Thank you. Or has an edition been made of the piano concerto? What's the sort of, what are we to look forward to in terms of being able to access the music?
Well, hopefully her entire catalogue will be published in the not impossibly distant future. And this is going to be so important for getting her music out there. So yes, these editions now exist, obviously, that got used for this album. And Tom Edney at the Royal College of Music has done a fantastic job doing an awful lot of editorial work, frankly, on the manuscripts. He's been amazing. And so hopefully we're looking forward to publication.
Oh my gosh. So is her music currently at the Royal College of Music?
Yes, all her manuscripts are at the Royal College.
But she didn't study there, am I right? Or she didn't?
No, but so it's because of the father's connection, and so that's how her material has ended up at the Royal College. Until recently, an awful lot of material was in boxes in a family cupboard, which is the stuff that I'd been working with when I first came to Avril Coleridge-Taylor's music many years ago now. I mean, there was so much more than what was in the Royal College of Music. And this was what the turning point for me, where I was like, okay, this is a composer who's really extraordinary and has so much to say. And those manuscripts, I think, now have also made their way to the Royal College. So Royal College is where it's at.
There are so many sort of hidden depths to this work, and part of that is Leah's rapport with the family, to make sure that the family feel comfortable with a project, and to make sure that everyone's sort of on board with doing this music justice and getting it out there. I think it's a really important layer to this work. Because, once the music is out there, yes, people will be able to come in and just play it. But there's so much that goes on behind the scenes. And that's why I was saying earlier about just being so grateful that we could bring different things to the table and different responsibilities. And that dynamic with the family is just so important. So, yeah.
Especially because, Avril only died in the 1990s. We're talking about a composer who's very much in living memory. And I think it's so important to respect that this is somebody's relative, it is somebody and that sense of legacy and how it should be shaped, given that this is sort of, we're not talking about a composer who has 48 albums coming out. There are multi-million-pound recording projects dedicated to them. It's just another recording. This is important. And I think a lot of it has been about how is Avril going to be situated? What's the story we're telling about Avril Coleridge-Taylor? I've been so glad to work with you on it. It has felt like a collaboration, and I think honestly, I can't think of another pianist who could have done what you've done, both on the kind of performance and historical side. And the sound is better than I could have imagined. I think when we were first thinking about this disc, so it's felt like very emotional.
The award-winning Leah Broad, your author side, in 2023 you published Quartet, which has gone on to be, it continues to be such an important resource and discovery and just piece of art, really, to be honest. So book 2 is coming out in the future. Part of the book is there's a section or chapters dedicated to Avril. What can you tell us about why? I know your book, we can say, is about women, music and World War II. Where does Avril fit within that?
So the book is about women and music in wartime. And I wanted to, there are so many war works by men, Shostakovich 7, blah, 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 blah. Great, but I wanted to know, okay, what were women writing? It felt completely implausible to me that men would be responding to World War II and women went, oh, well, I have nothing to say. As composers, many women responded to World War II and wrote explicit wartime compositions. When I was digging into Avril Coleridge-Taylor's music, so many of her pieces were written during World War II and were explicit responses to wartime events. And that felt so important as a story to tell, that actually here was this woman who was writing these pieces about war, about death, about, these very sort of philosophical ideas that are, I think, sometimes thought of as not what women wrote about. They wrote nice lullabies and things like this. And actually, no, Avril Coleridge-Taylor was there. She was composing enormous orchestral and choral works that were about wartime. So she's the one composer actually in the next book. And that's been fascinating, having to go and sort of write so much of her biography. I found out a lot that, I can't give too much away for the next book, but I hope that will give more context for who this woman was and hopefully to continue to tell her story a bit more. And some of those works, because they have choir in them as well, are not included on this disc. So if you're a choir out there, there are some really interesting wartime works, and there's solo piano pieces, there are songs. She responded in so many ways to the war around her.
Mm-hmm. And I know for my own response to the orchestral music on this disc and what you write in your booklet, very brilliantly written booklet notes, is about this cinematic sort of sensibility, and she's a legend for a melody. I'm kind of thinking this could be like the theme tune of something really iconic in the 20th century.
She never had the opportunity to write film music, and there were times where Sam and I were looking through these scores and we'd be going like, what's she doing here? And when I think it was the point where you were like, oh, it's very theatrical, and we were thinking about that, and everything sort of falls into place when you hear the storytelling in her music. And that's one of the things that really draws me to her as a composer. She has something very specific to say, and she's got a wonderfully cinematic way of doing it.
It's very syncable, sort of like, oh, this would work so well in this kind of film, or this would work so well in this kind of film.
I guess I've also tried to kind of think of a wider vocabulary for her music, because it would be very easy to say, it's very beautiful, because it is, but then there's something else, and also just even the physicality of playing her notes, and some of the gestures are so dramatic in ways where the piano becomes an instrument for something else that she wants to say. There's this one gesture, I think it's the third movement, where I'm doing a glissando with my right hand and I'm also playing arpeggios at the same time, and thinking, this is so strange. Physically, this feels so strange. But then when you hear it with the orchestra, it completely makes sense. But I'm thinking, how did she think of that? And what I don't know, what was the stimulus for her to do that? But then it completely makes sense.
It'd be great if each of you could choose a moment from this album to shout out, or maybe even something that just very personally, you think is very personally beautiful, or you'd like to recommend.
Well, I'm going to go for two. Okay. I'm going to go for the piano concerto, just because the sound world is so exciting. There's something very familiar about it, but there's also, it takes us on a new kind of adventure, I would say. And by the time we get to the third movement, there's just this real momentum, I think, in terms of her storytelling and emotionally, and the sound world that's just really quite thrilling. But I'm also going to go with From the Hills, because is that the one you were going to say? I didn't know what to expect. So after I was done listening to the piano concerto for like, the 1,000th time, I decided to listen to the rest of the album. And when I got to that one, I just felt gripped in a way that is quite difficult to put into words, but there was just something about it that was, I think, very haunting, that was just very compelling. I think it was just because it was so unexpected. So I'll let you pick up on that one.
Well, no, I mean, so this is one where when we were going through on what should be the track list, I almost didn't put this one forward to John because I was like, it has this very sectional structure on the page. And I think this is why it's so important to have recordings of this music, and recordings that are good with a conductor and an orchestra who've got this music, have taken the time to study it and understand what she's doing, because I wasn't sure it was going to work. And then when we listened through to the album, this was the one where I was like, this is great. It's so melodramatic. It is, in some senses, what I saw on the page. But when it comes together with the orchestra, you're like, oh, I see what you were doing. This makes so much sense. And it's so over the top and fun. I love it. It's a really powerful piece. I really enjoyed it. And then I guess the other one I'd maybe pick is the 1945 In Memoriam to the RAF. So this is one of her wartime pieces, and her then partner was in the RAF, and so she set up an RAF choir and orchestra in World War II. She was sort of following him around in his postings. She was in Scotland, and she knew a number of people, of course, who were killed in action. And this, I think, is one of the ways where she writes so personally. This was her sort of way of saying goodbye to those people, was in this In Memoriam. And it's a really touching piece of music. And that I think was very emotional, hearing that, writing about her wartime experience, and then to hear how that comes together with the full orchestra was a really wonderful thing to hear.
I would say there's something very timeless about that piece as well. It, even though this is the first time we'll be hearing it, it kind of feels like it's been around.
I think you can tell when a composer is writing with integrity, and it really feels like that is precisely what she did.
Well, Leah and Samantha, thank you so much for joining me. This has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for listening to the Gramophone Podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, consider taking out a subscription to Gramophone magazine by visiting gramophone.co.uk/magazine, and join us next week for another Gramophone Podcast.